What's up guys, back with another Fallout 4 video, and today I wanted to do something a little different from either the theory videos or the guns and weapons countdowns that I normally do, and talk to you guys about something that I've been pretty interested in recently, and that is virtual reality. Now, I can understand why a lot of people are skeptical of virtual reality gaming. After all, the Oculus Rift was originally going to be a $300 device that ended up launching at $600. And then there's the HTC VIVE and the PSVR, which also had incredibly high launch prices, and all of these headsets didn't even include either the $1,000 plus gaming PC or the $300 to $400 PS4 in order to even use them. And then there are the reports of people getting motion sickness with VR headsets, and there's also the fact that there isn't really enough high-quality software to justify the cost. However, we've been starting to see prices go down, and we've also been starting to see a couple AAA titles like Resident Evil 7, SKYRIM, and Fallout 4 get virtual reality versions. And while it's lame that most of these titles currently have exclusivity to a particular platform, it's arguably worse for Fallout 4 VR because there's a possibility that you might not have a gaming PC, and even if you do have a gaming PC, you may not have an HTC VIVE, which is required to play the game. But despite those issues, I do want to talk about why you should still be excited for Fallout 4 VR, even if you may have to wait a little bit before you can actually play it. So I guess without further ado, let's talk about the first reason you should eventually be excited, and that revolves around price. As I mentioned earlier, prices for virtual reality and VR gaming are starting to go down, and while prices are still relatively high in 2017, I'm pretty sure that by 2018 and 2019, the graphics cards required to run VR will be much cheaper, and the headsets themselves will also be much cheaper. After all, the HTC VIVE is now $600 as opposed to its $800 launch price, and both the PSVR and Oculus Rift are now $400 instead of $500 and $600. In fact, we're already starting to see price cuts below the $400 mark on some of these headsets with the holidays approaching. I'm pretty confident that prices will continue to go down in 2018. And I wouldn't be surprised if the PSVR, Oculus Rift, and HTC Vive don't see another $100 to $200 price drop. So if you're remotely interested in virtual reality gaming and price has been the primary factor keeping you from jumping in, virtual reality is going to get much cheaper as time goes on. And as it pertains to Fallout 4 VR in particular, the price for a Vive and the computer required to run the Vive are going to be much cheaper. However, if you don't want to buy a Vive and a gaming PC, I think that within the next year or two, Fallout 4 VR will eventually become available elsewhere. But let me elaborate on that. One of the major bummers with Fallout 4 VR is that, at least for the time being, it appears that the game will only be available on the HTC Vive. This obviously sucks because if you want to play Fallout 4 VR, then you need to buy an HTC Vive regardless of whether you own an Oculus Rift or not. And if you own a PSVR, you're pretty much screwed and can't get the game at all unless you buy a PC and a Vive headset. There's also the fact that because the Vive is currently the most expensive of the three VR headsets, it may be hard to justify that cost just to play one game. However, I suspect that Fallout 4 VR's Vive exclusivity won't last for very long. And while it's hard to say if Fallout 4 VR will come to PlayStation 4 or Oculus Rift, I do suspect that it could possibly be updated in the future to be compatible with Microsoft's recently released Windows Mixed Reality headsets. And if Microsoft is planning on what I think they're planning on, it's likely that Windows Mixed Reality headsets will eventually become compatible with the recently released Xbox One X. And for that reason, it's possible that we could see Fallout 4 VR on console next year, which is great if you don't like to play on PC. There's also the fact that it doesn't seem to make a whole lot of business sense for Bethesda to just make Fallout 4 VR exclusive to one platform. And given that we've definitely seen a bunch of re-releases of Skyrim in the form of things like Skyrim Special Edition, Skyrim from Nintendo Switch, and Skyrim VR for PlayStation VR, Bethesda is probably going to try and port Fallout 4 VR to some other VR platform in the near future. So ultimately, if you don't want to buy an HTC Vive, there will probably be a point in the near future where you don't have to, as Fallout 4 VR will likely be available in some other form. Another reason why I think you should eventually be excited for Fallout 4 VR is because I've got a feeling that it's going to play better than Skyrim VR did, not just for technical reasons, but also from a design perspective. Now, while the version of Skyrim VR that was released for PlayStation VR was a pretty good port and is definitely recommended by me if you own a PlayStation VR headset, I did feel that Skyrim VR was limited by some of the PSVR's technical limitations. For example, the PSVR uses one camera for tracking, which made you have to either press the circle or X buttons on your Move controllers in order to turn around in-game. Now, while I haven't played Fallout 4 VR, I'm pretty sure that you won't be having these problems because the Vive allows you to use up to 2 different sensors in order to track movement both in front and behind you. I think it's also worth mentioning that Fallout 4 VR is probably going to be a better match for virtual reality than Skyrim VR was, because Fallout 4 is a post-apocalyptic RPG shooter, while Skyrim is more of a melee-based adventure RPG. Now, shooters tend to work better with VR because most VR controllers are designed with triggers, and for that reason, they tend to conform better to guns rather than melee weapons. So I would say for that reason, even if you end up playing Fallout 4 VR on PC and it gets released on another platform like Xbox or PS4, I think you'll find that pointing a gun and shooting it feels better than swinging a sword currently does. My only complaint is that Fallout 4 VR won't be launching with the DLC, and that is one area in which Skyrim VR was definitely superior. However, provided that we eventually get that DLC for Fallout 4 VR for free, like we did for Skyrim VR, then Fallout 4 VR will be excellent. Now, my fourth reason comes down to mod support, and while there hasn't been any official mod support confirmed for Fallout 4 VR as of yet, I suspect that we will most likely probably be seeing mods at launch. Now, for those of you that had the original Fallout 4 at launch on PC, you will know that Fallout 4 had mods you could download from day one on the Nexus, and this was despite the fact that no official mod support was available. And while most of these were fairly simple mods like texture mods, I don't see how we couldn't see similar mods for Fallout 4 VR. And I also suspect that in time, Bethesda will update the creation kit to be compatible with Fallout 4 VR. That way, we could possibly see currently popular mods for Fallout 4 be ported over to Fallout 4 VR. It's also possible that we could get exclusive mods for Fallout 4 VR. For example, a dual-wield mod could actually work fairly well with Fallout 4 VR, and it would be pretty amusing to dual-wield 2 Fatmans. Or perhaps we could see a mod that allows the player to block bullets, either in the form of like a riot shield, which you can physically lift in front of your face to block bullets, or you could have something like we've seen in Superhot VR or Total Recall, where you can just block the bullets with your guns, which that would be pretty cool. If you ask me, it's likely that Fallout 4 VR will get official mod support at some point, and when that happens, we're likely going to be seeing some awesome ports of existing mods, as well as some great new mods that are only accessible with a VR headset and virtual reality controllers. My final reason you should be excited concerns the future. and provided that Fallout 4 VR and Skyrim VR are successful, they could pave the way for VR support in future Bethesda Game Studios titles. For example, maybe the next Fallout or Elder Scrolls game will either be designed with virtual reality in mind, or at the very least, offer some kind of virtual reality support so the player can choose how they want to play the game. So if you're not a fan of virtual reality, you can simply play with the TV and your controller like you normally would. But if you have a virtual reality headset, you can hook that up to your PC or console and play the next Bethesda Game Studios game that way. Or maybe you could have sort of a hybrid solution like we've seen with Skyrim VR, where you can physically wear the headset on your head while still playing with the controller. That way, you can gain some of the benefits that virtual reality provides, like a sense of depth perception in-game, while still being able to comfortably play with a controller on your couch. While this doesn't necessarily pertain to Fallout 4 VR, it's also worth mentioning that Fallout 4 VR's success could mean that we eventually see other developers incorporate virtual reality modes into their games as well. Perhaps at some point in the future, we will get a Call of Duty game that can be played in both virtual reality as well as with your standard controller and TV setup. And the same goes with other popular shooters like Overwatch or Battlefield, as both could possibly benefit from having a virtual reality version or mode. At the end of the day, I guess we're going to have to just wait and see. But what I will say is that if you're either on the fence about virtual reality and or you're just waiting for the prices to go down, I think you should be excited because you'll probably be playing Fallout 4 VR pretty soon. But alright guys, I think that's going to pretty much wrap up this particular video. If you liked this video, feel free to leave a like, click the bell to join the notification squad, and as always, take care, and I'll see y'all next time.